oil, ayatollahs, nuclear program. Most likely that's what comes to your mind when you think of Iran. And maybe also the axis of evil, a phrase that George Bush used in 2002 and that has stuck to the country in news headlines ever since. Now, here's another fact. At the United Nations headquarters in New York, there's a copy of an ancient clay cylinder. It has a text inscribed in cuneiform, which some historians call the first declaration of human rights in history. It was written by an Iranian 2,500 years ago. So why is it that the country that gave the world the first idea about the rights of conquered peoples is now itself under international sanctions? Why is it that a civilization that neither Alexander the Great nor Genghis Khan nor the Arab armies could destroy now lives behind an iron curtain of oil embargoes and diplomatic isolation? How did one country go from Cyrus to Khamenei, and why is Iran perhaps the most misunderstood country in the world? Greetings to everyone watching Amazing History. My name is Semyon, and today we have the complete history of Iran, from the first cities on the Iranian plateau to the nuclear deal. Before we begin, I want to thank our sponsors who make big history videos like this possible. Well, I won't keep you waiting any longer. Let's go. The history of the lands we call Iran begins long before the first Persians appeared on the political stage. As early as the end of the 4th millennium BC, the civilization of Elam existed in the southwest of the Iranian plateau. Its capital, the city of Susa, was a major trade and cultural center long before Rome became a village. The Elamites traded with Mesopotamia, developed their own writing system, built monumental temples, and from time to time terrorized their neighboring Sumerians and Babylonians. Elam remained one of the key powers in the region for almost 2,000 years, until it was finally defeated by the Assyrians in the mid-7th century BC. King Ashurbanipal destroyed Susa so thoroughly that he even boasted about it in his chronicles. He said, "Look, I even scattered the ashes of their ancestors to the wind." However, while the Elamites were fighting with Assyria, for several centuries, Indo-Iranian tribes, whom we know by the common name Aryans, had already been filtering onto the Iranian plateau from the north and east. They came in waves, settled down, mixed with the local population, and gradually formed new societies. Among them, two peoples stood out, who shaped the region's future. These were the Medes and the Persians. The Medes settled in the northwest of the plateau, and in the 7th century BC they created the first major Iranian kingdom. It was they who, in alliance with Babylon, defeated the Assyrian Empire and divided its territories. North of Assyria were the Persians, dressed in skins and felt caps. At first they looked quite modest against the dazzling splendor of ancient civilizations. Herodotus described them as unpretentious people who did not drink wine and were indifferent to gold, valuing only strength and truth, and skill at archery. While the great Elam was bleeding in wars with Assyria, the leader of the Persians, Achaemenids, who founded the Achaemenid dynasty, established himself in the hilly region of Anshan. No one at that moment could have imagined that these barbarians from the outskirts, who had settled on poor pastures, would soon become the new masters of the world. And their humble settlement of Parswash would give its name to the greatest empire of the East. By the middle of the 6th century BC, the Medes had become deeply mired in luxury and intrigue. Their king, Ostiak, according to legend, had dreams that his grandson would become the ruler of the world and destroy his kingdom. That grandson was Cyrus, who would later be called the Great. Cyrus led the Persians in a revolt against Median rule. At the decisive moment, the Median army, tired of their king's despotism, simply switched sides to support the young Persian. This was the first example of defection. Iran's history shows how a leader's ideology and charisma can outweigh numerical advantage. Over the next 20 years, Cyrus created the largest empire the world had ever seen up to that point. In the west, he defeated the kingdom of Lydia. In the east, he subdued Bactria and Sogdiana. And in 539 BC, he took Babylon almost without a fight. The priests of Marduk opened the gates themselves. They were so fed up with their own king, Nabonidus, who was obsessed with religious reforms at the expense of state affairs. But conquest is not the reason why Cyrus is still remembered 2,500 years later. He returned the captive Jews to their homeland and allowed all peoples to worship their own gods. The famous Cyrus cylinder, discovered by archaeologists, is now called the first declaration of human rights. Historians, of course, argue about this, but at the very least, it is the first known document in which a conqueror publicly declares the rights of conquered peoples. Against the background of Assyrian kings who boasted about flaying the skin of their enemies, the contrast is truly striking. After the death of Cyrus in battle with the nomadic Massagetæ, the throne was eventually taken by Darius I, who turned the unstable union of kingdoms into a well-functioning state apparatus. Darius divided the vast territory from India to Egypt into 20 satrapies. Each was headed by a governor, but behind them were the eyes and ears of the king, a secret police accountable only to the center. To ensure that orders arrived on time, a royal road was built, stretching 2,500 kilometers. The speed of information transmission along it was incredible for ancient times. Riders, taking turns, delivered mail from Susa to Sardis in just 7 days, while a regular caravan took 3 months. The geopolitical situation of that time was unique. Persia became the first world empire, absorbing almost all the ancient civilizations of the East. The only serious challenge came from the Greek city-states. For Darius, and later for his son Xerxes, the campaigns in Greece were more like police operations to pacify rebellious outskirts than a struggle for survival. Ironically, it was these conflicts, Marathon and Salamis, which for the Persians were merely local, that Western historiography came to regard as the moment civilization was saved, even though for the Achaemenids themselves defeats on that distant peninsula were painful but not catastrophic. The Achaemenid Empire continued to exist for another century and a half and remained the richest state in the world. By the middle of the 4th century BC, the great Achaemenid Empire began to resemble a colossus with feet of clay. The satraps in the provinces increasingly behaved like independent kings, while the central authority in Persepolis was drowning in harem intrigues. It was at this moment that Alexander the Great invaded from Macedonia. Many like to portray his swift conquest of Persia as the fall of Eastern despotism at the hands of Western freedom. But in reality, Alexander simply wanted to become the new king of Persia. After his victory, he immediately put on Persian clothes, introduced the ritual of bowing to the monarch, and forced his generals to marry local noblewomen. When Alexander suddenly died in Babylon, his empire collapsed, and Iran fell under the rule of the Greek Seleucids for a decade. They were talented administrators, but their state was too large, too diverse, and too dependent on the personality of the ruler. By the middle of the 3rd century BC, the eastern provinces of their state began to fall away one by one. It was then that the Parthians appeared in the northeast of the Iranian plateau. The Parthian tribes, skilled horsemen and archers, began to methodically reclaim the plateau from the Greeks. By the 1st century BC, the Parthian kingdom had become a new superpower. It became a thorn in the side of Rome, which was expanding eastward. Geopolitically, Parthia became an iron curtain between Rome and China. Roman legions, accustomed to crushing their enemies in infantry formations, suffered humiliating defeats time and again in the sands of Mesopotamia. The most notorious failure was the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC, where the richest man in Rome, Marcus Crassus, lost his army, his head, and, according to legend, was forced to drink molten gold. For nearly 500 years, the Parthian Empire maintained Iran's status as an insurmountable barrier. The Parthians controlled key points of the Silk Road, grew rich from the transit of Chinese silk and Indian spices, and forced Rome to acknowledge that there was a power in the East equal to their own. However, by the 3rd century AD, the Parthian Empire had weakened. Endless wars with Rome drained its resources. Internal strife between aristocratic clans became the norm. And in 224 AD, a Persian nobleman from the province of Pars named Ardashir Papakan defeated the last Parthian king, Artabanus IV, and declared himself the founder of the new Sassanid dynasty. But while the Parthians were warriors and pragmatists, the Sassanids became ideologues. They proclaimed Iranshar as the kingdom of the Aryans and made Zoroastrianism a strict state religion. If you thought that the concepts of heaven and hell, the last judgment, and the struggle between good and evil came into Christianity and Islam through Judaism, keep in mind that all these ideas first appeared in Zoroastrianism on the Iranian plateau. Sasanian Iran reached incredible splendor. Shahanshahs like Shapur I did not just defend themselves, they captured Roman emperors. The famous bas-relief at Nakshi Rustam still shows Emperor Valerian kneeling before the Persian king. It was an era of chivalry, refined music, and grand engineering structures. The Persians built huge arched palaces without a single support, such as Tak Kasra, whose ruins still capture the imagination in Ctesiphon. But behind this grandeur lay a fatal systemic flaw. For nearly 4 centuries, Iran and the Byzantine Empire waged a total war of attrition. They built fortresses, burned each other's cities, and spent all their resources on an endless struggle for Armenia and Mesopotamia. By the middle of the 7th century, both empires were financially and morally bankrupt. The soldiers had not received their pay for years, and the population was crushed by taxes. And it was at that moment, when the great powers of antiquity had weakened each other to the limit, that a new force emerged from the deep sands of the Arabian Peninsula, carrying the banner of a new faith. By 651, the Sassanid Empire had finally fallen under the blows of the Arab horsemen. For many contemporaries, it seemed like the end of the world. The ancient faith of Zarathustra was being displaced by Islam, and the Persian language by Arabic. However, Iranian civilization possessed a unique quality. It was too complex and advanced to simply disappear. The Arab caliphs quickly realized that it was impossible to govern vast territories without the experience of Persian officials. As a result, the conquerors of yesterday began to adopt Persian methods of governance, court etiquette, and even fashion. A period began that historians call the Persian Renaissance. Although the Persians did not accept Islam immediately, they eventually did, but they filled the new faith with their own philosophical ideas and administrative practices. The capital of the Caliphate, Baghdad, was built following the model of circular Persian cities, and key positions in the state were occupied by Iranian dynasties of viziers. It was during this time that Iran gave the world its greatest geniuses, the mathematician Al-Khwarizmi, whose name gave rise to the word algorithm, and the philosopher Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna. But the Iranian world did not intend to remain in the shadow of foreign caliphs for long. As early as the 9th century, the first dynasties began to appear, such as the Tahirids, Safavids, and Samanids. In fact, these were independent rulers who recognized the supreme authority of Baghdad only formally. The Samanids stood out in particular, as they deliberately revived Persian culture and language, funded poets and scholars, and built cities. It was at their court that Ferdowsi began work on the Shahnameh, an epic about Persian kings that became the national book of Iranians for centuries to come. In the 10th century, Turkic tribes began to arrive from the Central Asian steppes. At first, they infiltrated the Islamic world as slave warriors, then as mercenaries, and later as military commanders. And at some point, it suddenly turned out that they already held real military power in their hands, without which the caliphate could not exist. The Seljuks went down this path faster than others. In 1055, the Seljuk leader Targulbek entered Baghdad and received the title of Sultan from the Abbasid Caliph, that is, the secular ruler of the entire Sunni world. And the Caliph remained a symbol of religious authority. At that time, there was even a political joke that said, "The Caliph prays, the Seljuk fights, and the Persian vizier governs." But even though the Seljuks spoke Turkish, the official language of their empire became Farsi. Persian officials and scholars once again became indispensable. Nizam al-Mulk, the great Persian vizier under 2 Seljuk sultans, wrote the Siyasatnama, a treatise on government, which political scientists still study today. At the Seljuk court, Omar Khayyam was active, not only as a poet, but also as an outstanding mathematician and astronomer. The Seljuk state lasted for about 150 years and broke up into several regional sultanates. The Iranian world was once again fragmented. That was unpleasant, but what came from the east was incomparably worse. In the 13th century, Genghis Khan and his successors turned the prosperous cities of Iran into ruins, destroying irrigation systems that had been built over thousands of years. The population fell to half, or even a third of its former size. We will never know the exact numbers, but the scale of the catastrophe is beyond doubt. And then the Mongols settled down. The grandchildren of Genghis Khan, who ruled the Iranian lands as part of the Ilkhanate, began to adopt Islam and patronize Persian culture. Hulagu Khan, who destroyed Baghdad in 1258 and killed the last Abbasid caliph, was married to a Nestorian Christian woman and sympathized with Buddhists. His grandson Ghazan Khan converted to Islam in 1295 and made it the state religion. The Mongol Khans began to build mosques, fund manuscripts, and surround themselves with Persian scholars and poets. After the collapse of the Mongol states in the 14th century, a new conqueror emerged, Timur, known in Europe as Tamerlane. His campaigns across Iran were accompanied by mass killings and the construction of enclosed towers made of skulls. And Isfahan, after a rebellion against the Timurid governor, lost, according to various estimates, 70,000 inhabitants. But here we see another paradox. Timur's son Shah Shahrukh and his grandson Ulugh Beg turned Samarkand and Herat into brilliant centers of Persian culture. Ulugh Beg built an observatory in Samarkand and compiled a star catalogue with a level of accuracy European science at the time could not match. The Timurid court financed miniature painting, architecture, and poetry, and the Persian language was once again the language of culture and power. By the end of the 15th century, the Timurid state had disintegrated. Iran was once again fragmented among competing tribal federations, political chaos, infighting, and the absence of central authority. The country was waiting for its unifier. And such a figure emerged. The true revival of the nation-state happened in 1501 with the rise of the Safavid dynasty. This was a turning point for the region's geopolitics. Shah Ismail made Shi'ism the state religion, which became a powerful tool for self-identification. This decision forever separated Iran from the Sunni Ottoman world in the west and the Uzbek Khanates in the east. It was Shah Ismail who turned Shiite imams and theologians into part of the state apparatus, which would later, 4.5 centuries later, have completely unforeseen consequences. The Turks did not appreciate such audacity. In 1514, the epic Battle of Chaldiran took place. The Persian elite cavalry, still bound by armor and tradition, faced off against Turkish artillery. Essentially, it was a clash of medieval swords with firearms. The Iranians were simply shot down, and Ismail, who had previously been considered invincible, broke down psychologically. He stopped commanding and turned to heavy drinking for the rest of his life. But the state itself survived and reached its peak under Shah Abbas the Great. He realized that to defeat the Turks, he had to play by their rules. Abbas dismissed the arrogant tribal chiefs, created a proper army with cannons and muskets, and moved the capital to Isfahan. The city was turned into a showcase of the empire. Huge squares, incredible mosques, and bazaars. Abbas opened the country to Western merchants and diplomats, trading silk and seeking allies against the Ottomans. It was under the Safavids that the Iran we know today was formed, a mix of ancient Persian pride and Shia fanaticism. But after Abbas's death, everything followed the usual pattern: weak heirs, an empty treasury, and endless parties in the palace instead of governing the country. The result was predictable. In 1722, wild Afghan tribes simply came, besieged the capital, and brought the Safavid dynasty to an end. When the Safavids finally collapsed, Iran became a free-for-all. But then Nader Shah appears. He was a real military maniac and a genius all in one. He kicked out the Afghans, gave the Ottomans a beating, and to really make a name for himself, he went to India, from where he brought back so much gold and precious stones that taxes were cancelled for 3 years. He was called the Napoleon of the East, but the ending was classic: paranoia, cruelty, and being killed by his own guards. After Nadir Shah was stabbed in his own tent, Iran went through a lot of turmoil until the Qajars seized power in 1796. They moved the capital to Tehran. At that time, it was a backwater town that had nothing to boast about except its view of the mountains. But the problem wasn't with the capital, it was that the world around Iran had changed beyond recognition. While the Persian Shahs were still living in a medieval fantasy, Europe went through the Industrial Revolution. And then the most painful part began. The Russian Empire started pushing in from the north. In 2 wars at the beginning of the 19th century, Iran suffered a crushing defeat and lost all of the Caucasus, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. The Treaty of Turkmenchay of 1828 became a national disgrace for the Persians. They not only gave up their lands, but also granted the Russians such trade privileges that the local merchants were outraged. From the south, the British were also putting pressure. As a result, the two predators, Russia and Britain, simply divided Iran into spheres of influence without even asking the Iranians. Iran formally remained independent, but this independence was purely decorative. The Shahs from the Qajar dynasty, in order to pay for their whims and trips to Europe, handed out concessions to foreigners for everything: roads, banks, and resources. It got to the point where one British baron bought the rights to exploit almost all of the country's resources. This was the largest capitulation in history. The government literally sold its own land wholesale. And then, in 1908, oil was discovered. The British immediately created a company and took 84% of the profits for themselves, leaving Iran with mere scraps. The country was sitting on a sea of black gold, but remained poor. The people couldn't take it anymore. Back in 1905, the constitutional revolution began. Merchants, students, and even priests forced the Shah to sign the constitution. It seemed like this was a chance for normal development. But no such luck. The great powers did not want a strong and free Iran. In 1911, Russian Cossacks simply shelled the Iranian parliament building with cannons. The democratic experiment was drowned in blood. Iran entered the 20th century with its hopes burned and a wild anger toward the rest of the world. This rage had been building up for years, until in 1921, a stern man in a Cossack uniform rode into Tehran and decided, "If you can't come to an agreement, I'll bring order here myself." This was Reza Khan, from a humble military family. With the tacit support of the British, he swept aside the old regime and in 1925 proclaimed himself Reza Shah Pahlavi. He chose his surname with a hint, as it was the name of the language of the ancient Persians. The message was clear: we are no longer a province, we are the heirs of a great empire. Reza Shah launched a harsh top-down drive, building railways, opening universities, and creating an army along European lines. And in 1935, he even forbade foreigners from calling the country Persia and demanded that they use the name Iran. On this basis, he even flirted with Hitler, hoping that Germany would help him get rid of British and Soviet control. But the bet didn't pay off. In 1941, the USSR and Britain wasted no time and simply sent troops into Iran to transport Lend-Lease supplies and pump oil for the war. The army that the Shah had been building for 20 years collapsed in just a couple of days. Reza Shah himself was sent into exile, and his young son Mohammad Reza was put on the throne. After the war, a wave of nationalism rose in Iran. Everyone was fed up with the British pumping oil for next to nothing. The leader of the protest was Mohammad Mossadegh, an intelligent lawyer who, in 1951, just went ahead and nationalized the entire oil industry. Britain was furious. They blocked exports and declared Iranian oil to be stolen. The economy began to sink, and that's when the CIA intervened. In 1953, the Americans and the British carried out Operation Ajax. They hired crowds, bribed the military, and staged a coup. Mossadegh was put under arrest, and the Shah returned to power as a total puppet of the West. It was then that Iranians developed that intense hatred for American spies, which would explode 25 years later. The Shah became the gendarme of the Persian Gulf. Oil money and American weapons flowed in abundance. He created Safavid, a terrifying secret police force that suppressed any dissent. In 1963, he launched the White Revolution, an attempt to rapidly turn Iran into a modern Western country. Women were given rights, land started being distributed to peasants, and education improved. Sounds cool. On paper, yes, but in reality, the Shah managed to turn everyone against himself at once: the clergy, the merchants, and the villagers. The loudest critic was a cleric from the city of Qom named Ruhollah Khamenei. He openly called the Shah a puppet of the US and Israel, and the Shah simply expelled Khamenei from the country, making him a living symbol of resistance. He thought he had gotten rid of the problem, but in reality he just sent his main enemy to quietly prepare the revolution. While the Shah was celebrating the anniversary, the exiled preacher Khamenei made a technical breakthrough that the intelligence services simply overlooked. He recorded his angry speeches on regular audio cassettes in France and in Iran. Thousands of copies were made. This was the first high-tech revolution in history, where information defeated tanks. By 1978, everyone had united against the Shah, from leftist students to tough bazaar merchants. The Shah was torn. At times he ordered to shoot, then he promised reforms. This indecisiveness was his downfall. In January 1979, the Shah left the country, taking with him a handful of his homeland's soil and leaving behind the ruins of his empire. 2 weeks later, a plane from Paris landed in Tehran. Khamenei was greeted by millions of people. When he was asked how he felt returning after 15 years, he replied coldly, "Nothing." The Islamic Republic won the referendum with a result of 98%. The liberals and socialists who helped overthrow the Shah thought that Grandpa Ayatollah would go pray in the mosque and give them power. Oh, how wrong they were. The revolution began to devour its own children. Yesterday's allies were thrown into the same prisons they had stormed together. Khamenei introduced a new concept, ruled by theologians. Now the country was ruled not by a politician, but by the highest spiritual authority. The final break with the West happened in the fall of 1979, when students seized the US Embassy and held diplomats hostage for 444 days, and after that, real hell began. Saddam Hussein thought that after the revolution, Iran had weakened and could be taken easily, but he ended up in the 20th century's longest and bloodiest bloodbath. Iraq was using chemical weapons against the Iranians. The West silently watched, and the US even managed to secretly sell weapons to Iran. The cynicism was off the charts. When the war ended in a draw in 1988, Khamenei said that agreeing to peace was like a cup of poison for him. Hundreds of thousands dead, the economy in ruins, and the borders remained exactly where they were. In 1989, Khamenei died. There was chaos at his funeral. People in hysteria were literally tearing the shroud to pieces, trying to touch the body. Power passed to Ali Khamenei. He was not a religious fanatic or a charismatic leader, but rather a calculating apparatchik. He was even given the title of Ayatollah retroactively to make everything look legitimate. Khamenei created a system that still frightens all Western experts. Presidents change in Iran, sometimes liberals, sometimes radicals, but the real levers of power always remain with the supreme leader. In the 2000s, the main scare was the Iranian nuclear program. Tehran said, "We just need electricity." The West replied, "Yeah, sure, we believe you." The shadow war began. Iranian scientists were blown up in their cars, and highly sophisticated computer viruses were planted in industrial systems to sabotage the centrifuges. In 2015, it seemed like an agreement was reached. They signed the nuclear deal. Sanctions started to be lifted. Iran began to open up. But then Donald Trump came. He tore the deal to shreds and imposed even tougher sanctions than before. While diplomats argued about uranium enrichment percentages, a real Game of Thrones began on the ground. In 2020, the stakes skyrocketed. An American drone killed General Qasem Soleimani at Baghdad airport. For Iran, he was something like a national superhero and the main architect of the axis of resistance, in other words, the network of proxy forces stretching from Lebanon to Yemen. His death almost triggered World War III, but at that time the sides exchanged strikes and then went back to their corners. And now we come to today, when the proxy war that Iran had been waging for decades has turned into a direct and very dangerous conflict. After the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7, 2023, the region turned into a powder keg. Iran tried for a long time to stay in the shadows, pulling the strings of its allies Hezbollah and the Houthis, who started harassing merchant ships in the Red Sea. In 2024 and 2025, the shadow war finally came into the open. After a series of mutual strikes between Israel and Iran, the situation spiraled into a full-blown storm. Iran launched massive rocket attacks, and the coalition led by the US and Israel responded with Operation Epic Fury. On February 28, 2026, news spread around the world that no one believed at first. As a result of a precise strike in Tehran, Ali Khamenei was killed. However, the death of the old Ayatollah did not lead to the immediate collapse of the system as the West had hoped. On the contrary, the security apparatus responded instantly. The new supreme leader was announced as Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the late Ali Khamenei. He was granted the title of Ayatollah just as quickly as his father once was. And how this latest mess in the Middle East will end is hard to predict for now. But one thing is clear, we are living in the era of the Great Rift. And wherever the pendulum swings in Tehran, its echo will be felt in every home around the world. And what do you think? Will Mojtaba be the last ruler of this system, or will he build a new empire? Share your thoughts in the comments. This has been Amazing History. Stay tuned. The most interesting things are yet to come. Goodbye, everyone.